Milan's morning sun streamed through the huge glass windows of Alessandra Moretti's penthouse, tinting the white marble with golden reflections. From his balcony, the city spread out in a symphony of modern architecture and cobblestone streets, as if time intertwined between past and present. Alessandra, standing with a glass of espresso in her hand, watched her reflection in the glass. An impeccably made-up face, dark hair tied in a perfect bun, and a designer suit that screamed success. Everything was in its place. Everything, except something inside her. From the outside, Alessandra was the epitome of the powerful woman. Owner of Moretti Milan, an exclusive fashion brand, had achieved what many could only dream of: prestige, money, influence. Her shows in Paris and New York were acclaimed. Magazines called her the Empress of Contemporary Elegance, and her social circle was made up of moguls, artists, and celebrities. But when the bustle of the meeting ceased and the last glass of champagne was emptied at a gala, an unbearable silence enveloped her. An echo inside him that reminded him that something was missing. Years ago, Alessandra had believed that success would fill that void. That when he reached a certain status, when his company was at the top, when his name was etched in fashion history, that feeling would disappear. But the emptiness was not gone. It had only become quieter, more subtle, like a shadow that followed her every step. That morning, as he reviewed his company's financial reports, he felt a pang of anxiety. It was not something common for her. He had always handled crises coldly. However, the numbers in front of her were worrying. Key investors were withdrawing their support. There were rumors of a hostile takeover, a plot between partners to displace her. Something was moving in the shadows, and this time, I wasn't in control. He grabbed his phone and dialed his CFO. "Marco, I need to see you now." The tone of his voice was firm, but his pulse was quickening. He had never lost in business. He had never allowed a failure. 30 minutes later, in his glass office in the center of Milan, Marco handed him a folder with confidential documents. As she read, a feeling of vertigo hit her. "This is impossible, ... He whispered, closing the folder with a sharp snap. "Alessandra, there is something else." Marco avoided looking her in the eyes. "The bank has frozen certain assets. They need an audit." Alessandra's world began to collapse in slow motion. "Are you telling me I don't have access to my own money? Not only that, there are lawsuits on the way. And the press ... His phone buzzed with incessant notifications. Explosive headlines were beginning to appear in the media. The Moretti empire in crisis, a financial fraud? From the top to the abyss, the collapse of the queen of fashion. His breathing quickened. He felt a pressure in his chest. For the first time in his life, the ground beneath his feet seemed to crumble. That night, in the solitude of her penthouse, Alessandra poured herself a glass of wine and walked barefoot around the living room. The city continued to roar outside, indifferent to its crisis. He sat on his couch, staring into space. His success had always been his shield, his armor. Without him, what was left of her? Suddenly, she remembered something her mother used to tell her when she was a child. "Alessandra, never show weakness. If the world smells your fear, it will devour you." For years, I had followed that advice. And now, without his empire, without his mask of perfection, he felt a fear he had never faced before. The shadow he had ignored all his life was beginning to reveal itself. The sound of his phone vibrating on the marble table broke the early morning silence. Alessandra woke up with a start, her heart beating in her chest like a drum. His inbox was overflowing with messages. His company was on fire. The headlines exploded on the networks and in the financial media. Fraud at Moretti Milano. Irregularities in the company's finances. Alessandra Moretti loses control of her empire. An internal betrayal? The businesswoman faces the worst crisis of her career. Every word was a dagger piercing his public image, his credibility, his identity. He got out of bed and, breathing heavily, headed to the bathroom. He looked in the mirror. The face that used to radiate confidence was now marked by fatigue. Deep dark circles, pale skin, tight lips. I can't lose control. He repeated himself over and over again, but his hands trembled. Minutes later, she found herself in the Moretti Milano boardroom, surrounded by her management team. Eyes avoided his, voices faded when he entered. He sat up front, crossed his legs with forced elegance, and looked at Marco, his CFO. I want answers. Now Marco swallowed. The auditors found inconsistencies in the balance sheets for the last 3 years. The board believes you may have been manipulating the numbers to attract investors. Alessandra felt as if she had been hit in the stomach. Are you telling me that they are implying that I committed fraud? Not officially, but yes. His gaze scanned the room. People he had trusted, in whom he had invested years of work, now avoided his eye contact. Does anyone here believe I'm capable of something like that? He asked, his voice cutting like a knife. Silence. The betrayal outweighed the accusations. He took a deep breath and leaned back in the chair. Who was behind this? Marco looked at another of the managers, who looked away. Finally, Marco murmured, Luca De Santis. Alessandra felt a pang in her chest. Luca had been his right-hand man for a decade. He knew every corner of the company. He had been his most loyal partner. Or so he thought. What has he done? He asked with a strained voice. Luca convinced the board that they should temporarily remove you from leadership. If you don't present exonerating evidence, you could lose everything. Legally. The air became thick. Alessandra closed her eyes for a second. When he opened them, his determination had returned. Prepare a statement. We will deny everything. We will act quickly. But the damage was already done. The next few days were hell. His team began to distance himself. Investors withdrew their money. Important contracts were dissolved. His name, once synonymous with prestige, was now associated with scandal and distrust. One afternoon, upon arriving at her office, her secretary stopped her at the door. Mrs. Moretti. I'm sorry, they are already here. Alessandra frowned and walked forward, only to be met by 2 men in suits with cold faces. I'm the lawyer. For the board of directors, said one of them, handing him an envelope. The decision has been made to temporarily remove her as CEO while the investigation continues. His fingers closed on the envelope. This is a mistake. The lawyer did not flinch. We recommend that you not make public statements for now. Alessandra felt trapped in a nightmare. Hours later, she was back in her penthouse, sitting on the floor with a glass of whiskey in her hand. His phone vibrated incessantly, but he no longer had the strength to answer it. Everything he had worked for, his legacy, his sacrifice, was evaporating. But what terrified her most was not the loss of power or money. It was the feeling that without her success, she was nobody. For the first time in her life, Alessandra asked herself, who am I if I'm not Alessandra Moretti, the successful businesswoman? And he didn't know how to respond. The echo of her heels echoed in the empty penthouse lobby. It had been days since Alessandra last left her apartment. The outside world had become a battlefield, a place where his name was repeated in cruel headlines, in treacherous whispers, in looks of contempt. The calls eventually stopped. Even those who claimed to be his friends vanished in the storm. The apartment, once a symbol of his success, had been transformed into a glass cage. The huge windows no longer offered him majestic views of Milan, but rather a feeling of confinement. The city moved on without her. The nights were even worse. Alessandra began to have disturbing dreams. A faceless mannequin in a dark room. At first, he just stood there, motionless, staring at her without eyes. Then in each dream, the mannequin came a little closer. He would wake up with his heart racing, his body drenched in sweat. Something inside her was trying to communicate, but she couldn't understand it. The days merged into an endless loop of insomnia, whiskey, and dark thoughts. Alessandra stopped responding to messages. She stopped looking in the mirror. She stopped caring. Anxiety turned into panic. Sometimes he felt like the ground was disappearing from under his feet. His breathing became erratic. Success had sustained her all her life, and now that it was gone, she felt like she was falling into a bottomless abyss. One night, after several drinks, he collapsed on the couch and closed his eyes, and he dreamed about the mannequin again. But this time, he spoke. "You're not real." Alessandra woke up suddenly, her body rigid with fear. What did that mean? Who was that mannequin? And why did I feel like I knew him? He stood up unsteadily and walked to the mirror in his room. The reflection he saw was unknown to him. His hair messy, his skin dull, his eyes empty. For the first time in his life, felt invisible. For the first time, he was faced with the possibility that everything he thought he was an illusion. The train to Tuscany glided through the green fields, leaving the chaos of Milan behind. Alessandra looked out the window, her head leaning against the cold glass. His reflection gave him an image he barely recognized. The trip had not been planned. It had been an escape. When his world collapsed, the first thing he thought about was running away. But I had nowhere to go. Her friends had disappeared, her team had betrayed her, and the press had made her the villain of a story she didn't even fully understand. In the midst of his despair, he remembered Isabella, his Aunt Isabella. The only person who was never impressed by her success, who did not flatter her or look at her with envy. A woman who had always seen beyond the image that Alessandra projected. As a child, she spent summers at her home in Tuscany. She toured the vineyards, played with the dogs, and listened to the stories of Isabella, a retired psychologist with a worldview that often defied the relentless logic Alessandra had learned to live by. Isabella had insisted that true strength came not from control, but from acceptance. Accepting ourselves makes us free, Alessandra. Fighting against what we are chains us. Alessandra, in her youth, had always dismissed those ideas. Life was a battle, not an exercise in self-discovery. But now, with her empire reduced to ashes, with fear eating her from within, she was no longer so sure of anything. When she got off the train, the aroma of humid earth and the warm wind of Tuscany enveloped her. Isabella was waiting for her at the station, her gray hair tied up in a messy bun and her eternal linen shawl covering her shoulders. "Alessandra, he said softly, with that look that seemed to pierce her soul. Alessandra couldn't contain herself. She collapsed into his arms, the weight of weeks of anguish escaping in a trembling whisper. "I don't know who I am without everything I lost." Isabella hugged her tightly, like when she was a child returning from a fight with her mother. "Come, my dear," he whispered. "Let's go home." The old stone farmhouse was intact, as if time had not passed. The wood creaked under their feet as they entered. Alessandra dropped her bag and looked around. Everything seemed so familiar and, at the same time, so foreign. They sat at the kitchen table, a glass of wine in front of each of them. The fire in the fireplace crackled softly. Isabella looked at her calmly and bluntly said, "You didn't lose your company, Alessandra. You lost the mask with which you hid from yourself." The air seemed to stop. Alessandra felt a pang in her chest. What do you mean?" Isabella rested her elbows on the table and intertwined her fingers. "You were always a bright girl, but you were taught to believe that your value depended on what you achieved, what you built, what you projected. You created an empire to prove that you were strong. But you never learned to love yourself without all that." Alessandra looked away. His fingers trembled around the wine glass. I don't know who I am without my success." "Exact, and that's why this had to happen." The words hit her like lightning. "Do you think he deserved this?" he asked with a broken voice. Isabella shook her head. "It's not a question of merit. It's A matter of waking up. Everything you thought you were has crumbled. But that means you can now discover who you really are. The words hung in the air. For the first time, Alessandra felt something inside her break, but instead of fear, there was a hint of relief. Maybe, just maybe, Isabella was right. Perhaps what he had lost had never been his to begin with. Alessandra stayed in Tuscany longer than planned. The days passed between walks through the vineyards, long silences and deep conversations with Isabella. She had spent years running from herself, but here, far from the flashes, the investor meetings, and appearances she couldn't escape. One night, while they were dining by candlelight, Isabella put her wine glass on the table and stared at it. "It's time we talk about your shadow." Alessandra frowned. "My what?" "Your psychological shadow. The part of you that you have repressed your entire life." Isabella paused before continuing. "Carl Jung said that we all have a shadow self. It is the set of thoughts, desires and emotions that we reject because they do not fit with the image we want to project." Alessandra crossed her arms. "I'm not repressing anything." Isabella smiled softly. Of course you are. We all do it." Alessandra looked down. She had spent weeks trapped in her own despair, tangled in the idea that she had lost everything. But now he was wondering, why was that emptiness so unbearable? Why had the fall destroyed her so much? "You've built your identity around success because you fear what lies behind it," Isabella continued. "You are terrified of facing your greatest fear, the fear of abandonment and failure." Alessandra felt a knot in her stomach. "That's not true," he murmured. Isabella leaned towards her a little. "So tell me, why did you feel like you stopped existing when your company fell?" The words cut through her like a knife. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Isabella looked at her tenderly. "You have spent your life fighting to prove that you are strong, that you are capable, that you deserve to be seen and recognized. But what's underneath all that? Who are you when you take off your mask?" Alessandra felt trapped. A part of her wanted to get up and run away, but another part knew that Isabella was right. Images began to flow through his mind. His childhood. His mother, always busy, always demanding more from him. "Don't cry, Alessandra. Be strong." His adolescence. His father, distant, absent. Emotions won't get you anywhere. His adult life. Every achievement, every award, every recognition, seeking to fill a void that never disappeared. And now, with all that collapsed, she felt empty because she had never learned to exist without external validation. The mannequin of his dreams crossed his mind. No face, no identity. He covered his face with his hands and let out a shaky whisper. "I don't know who I am without all that." Isabella took her hand gently. "And that's where your real journey begins." Isabella's words haunted her. "You don't know who you are without all that. And that's where your real journey begins." Alessandra couldn't stop thinking about it. If she wasn't the successful businesswoman, the iron woman that everyone admired, then who was she? The answer was not in his present. It was in his past. Isabella proposed something to him the next day. "I want you to do an exercise." They were in the garden, under the shade of an ancient tree. Isabella handed him a notebook and a pen. "Write about your childhood. No filters, no frills. Just write the first thing that comes to mind." Alessandra felt a lump in her throat. "And what am I supposed to remember?" Isabella smiled calmly. "Don't think about it too much. Close your eyes and let memory guide you." Alessandra took a deep breath and let the images appear. His childhood home. An elegant but cold mansion. Perfect rooms, but empty of love. His father, an imposing businessman, always surrounded by numbers and contracts, barely spoke to him. When he did it, it was to demand more. "Is that all you can do, Alessandra? You can do better." Every achievement, every award, every recognition at school, it was not a cause for celebration. but a standard to be surpassed next time. And then there was his mother. Sweet, quiet, unable to defend herself before her husband. Alessandra remembered her sitting in the huge living room, with her hands clasped in her lap, looking out the window as if waiting for something that would never come. Sometimes it's better not to argue with your father, dear. His mother never raised her voice. He never said anything was bothering him. She never fought for herself, and Alessandra understood it. Either he was like his mother and surrendered to life, or he was like his father and dominated everything. He decided to be strong. She decided to be perfect, because little Alessandra learned that only when she did everything right ... did they look at her. He felt the pen shake in his hand as he wrote. The truth was brutal. His obsession with success had not been born of ambition, but of fear. From the fear of not being enough, from the fear of not being loved. Isabella watched her silently, giving her space. After a few minutes, Alessandra put the notebook on the table with a broken sigh. I always thought that being the best was my nature, but now I see that I was just avoiding feeling like an unwanted child. Isabella took her hand warmly. Exactly, dear. Your shadow is not failure, Alessandra. It's the little girl inside you who never felt enough. Alessandra felt something inside her break. For years she had tried to prove her worth to the world, but deep down, the person who needed convincing the most was herself. And for the first time in his life, he understood that success would never fill the void of a love he never received. That night, sleep came like a storm. Alessandra was in an empty theater. The red velvet seats were spread out before her, covered in dust. The stage was huge, but the lights were off. There was no audience. There was no applause, just silence. He felt a chill run down his spine, and then saw it. The faceless mannequin, standing in the center of the stage, still, silent, watching her without eyes. His mere presence paralyzed her. That being had haunted her dreams since her fall, but she had never faced it. The mannequin raised one arm and pointed at her. Cold sweat soaked his skin. His breathing became labored. I wanted to run. I wanted to escape from there, but something inside him whispered, "Don't run this time." For the first time, instead of running away, Alessandra took a step towards him. His feet echoed on the wooden floor of the stage. Another step, and another. Each step weighed as if dragging invisible chains. When he was just a few inches away, he stopped. The mannequin did not move. Alessandra swallowed and, with a surge of bravery, extended her trembling hand. He touched the smooth, cold surface of her face. And the mannequin changed. Her porcelain skin slowly cracked, as if an invisible mask was falling. A flash of light blinded her for an instant. When the vision returned, she saw herself, but it wasn't the Alessandra he knew. Era she as a girl. In a white dress, eyes big and scared, fragile, vulnerable, but real. A lump formed in his throat. The girl looked at her intently and, in a low voice, whispered, "Why did you forget me?" Alessandra's chest tightened. "I didn't forget you. ... He stammered, his eyes full of tears. The girl shook her head. "Yes, you did. You left me behind. You pretended it didn't exist." Alessandra fell to her knees, breathing heavily. All the weight of his life, all the effort to be strong, to be unstoppable, had been to silence that voice. "I just wanted to be strong. ... He whispered, his voice breaking. "But you're also fragile," the girl whispered. "And it's okay if you are." Tears fell down her face. For years, Alessandra had tried to destroy that part of herself. The part that doubted, that was afraid, that longed for love. He had hidden it under success. He had buried her with awards and achievements. But now he was here, in front of her, demanding to be seen. Alessandra extended her arms and hugged the girl, and the theater collapsed into light. She woke up with a start, her heart beating 1,000 miles an hour. His chest rose and fell. His skin was damp with sweat. He looked around. I was at Isabella's house. The dream was over, but something inside her had changed. For the first time in his life, he had looked his shadow in the eyes, and I had understood something. Couldn't continue running away. It was time to face his darkness. It was time to accept who I really was. Alessandra spent the morning in silence, still shocked by the previous night's dream. She had seen his shadow. He had seen the girl he had always tried to ignore. And now, he couldn't just hide her again. Isabella found her sitting in the garden, staring into the mountains of Tuscany. He sat next to her and waited patiently. "Do you want to talk about it?" he finally asked. Alessandra was slow to respond. "I dreamed about her," he whispered. "With my girl self." Isabella nodded, as if she had expected it. "And what did he tell you?" "That I abandoned her." A lump formed in his throat. Isabella said nothing, giving him space to process it. After a few minutes, he spoke softly. "It's time to bring her back." Alessandra looked at her confused. "How am I supposed to do that?" Isabella took out a notebook and a pen and placed them in front of her. "I want you to write him a letter." Alessandra looked at her suspiciously. "A letter?" "Yeah, to the girl you saw in your dream. Tell him what you never told him." Alessandra took the pen with trembling hands. He hesitated, but then he closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to write. "Dear little Alessandra, forgive me. Forgive me for ignoring you for so long. For demanding that you be perfect when you just wanted to be loved. I know you felt alone. I know you desperately wanted Mom and Dad to see you. And when they didn't, you decided that the only way to exist was to be flawless. But you didn't have to do it alone. You didn't have to be so strong all the time. It's okay to be afraid. It's okay to not know what to do. It's okay to be you. I'm not leaving you behind again. I see you, I hear you, I accept you." When he finished the letter, his hands were shaking. For the first time in her life, she felt that the little girl inside her was no longer alone. Isabella looked at her tenderly. "Now I want you to write another letter." "Whom?" "In your shadow. To that part of you that you have always rejected." Alessandra hesitated, but took up the pen again. "Dear shadow, I always saw you as my enemy, as the part of me that I had to hide. But now I understand that you only wanted to protect me. You were the one who made me strong when no one else did. You were the one who helped me survive in a world where I felt I had no right to be vulnerable. But I don't need to hide from you anymore. You are not my punishment. You are part of me. And I'm ready to accept you." As she finished the letter, she felt something inside her release, as if he had been carrying heavy armor his entire life, and had finally dropped it. That night, Isabella took her for a walk under the moon. "Now comes the hardest part," said her aunt. "I want you to stop fighting your fear of failure." Alessandra frowned. "And how am I supposed to do that?" Looking at him from the front, "Welcoming you, that sounds impossible." Isabella smiled. "Just try this. Say out loud that you are afraid, without judging it, without resisting it." Alessandra swallowed. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come out. "I had always thought that admitting fear was the same as failure. But now, I understood that fear only had power over her because she had avoided it her entire life." So he took a deep breath and whispered, "I'm afraid of failure." He felt something in his chest open. "I'm afraid of not being enough." The words floated on the night breeze. "I'm afraid that, without success, I won't have value." Isabella took her hand gently. "Now breathe." Alessandra closed her eyes and let fear pass through her. He didn't reject it. He didn't run away from him. Simply he felt it. And when he opened his eyes again, something had changed. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled her. For the first time, he felt a freedom he had never experienced before. Not because he had overcome his fear, but because finally, I had accepted it. For the first time in her life, Alessandra didn't have a plan. There were no meetings. There were no strategies. There were no urgent calls or emails to answer. There was only her, the warm Tuscan breeze, and the sound of leaves swaying in the wind. At first, the uncertainty was unbearable. His entire life had been defined by action, by constant movement. Now, just waking up without an agenda made her feel naked. But Isabella had told him something that resonated in his mind. You can't rebuild yourself with the same tools you used to destroy yourself. And that meant he couldn't fall back into the trap of defining his worth through his success. Days passed, and slowly Alessandra began to let go. She cooked with Isabella, cutting fresh tomatoes and kneading bread with his hands. I read on the terrace, without the pressure of taking advantage of the time for something productive. He would go for a walk among vineyards without a fixed destination, simply feeling the sun on his skin. Some nights, the anxiety still returned. That inner voice that told him that he was wasting his time, that he should do something. But then she took a deep breath and reminded herself, I don't have to prove anything to anyone. And the anxiety dissipated little by little. It was on one of those walks through the town when he met Marco. The small town market was full of colors and aromas. Alessandra was walking between the stalls, enjoying the feeling of not being in a hurry, when a chart caught his attention. It was a large canvas, painted with chaotic but vibrant brushstrokes, full of life. He stared at it, trying to figure out what was so special about it. You like it? Said a voice next to him. He turned around and saw a dark-haired man with a few days' worth of beard and paint-stained clothes. It's different, Alessandra answered honestly. Marco smiled. It always is for those who are used to order. She looked at him curiously. Are you the artist? Yes, but don't call it work, he said with an amused smile. Work is what you do to survive. I do this because I love doing it. That sentence left her frozen. When was the last time you did something simply because you loved it, without thinking about whether it had value, whether it would generate results? He couldn't remember. In the following days, Alessandra met Marco again. I saw him painting in a square, without worrying about selling his work, just enjoying the process. One day, he invited her to his workshop. It was absolute chaos. Brushes, fabrics, colored stains on the floor. There was something about that mess that felt free. Do you want to try it? He asked, handing her a paintbrush. Alessandra laughed. I don't know how to paint. It's not about knowing, Marco said. It's about feeling. She hesitated. All his life he had tried to do things right, to be perfect. But this time he decided to let go. He took the brush and dipped it in the paint. And for the first time in his life, created without fear of error. As the days passed, something about Marco intrigued her more and more. You don't seem to worry about the future, he told her one afternoon. Marco shrugged as he cleaned his brushes. Why would I? The future never comes. There's only this moment. Alessandra frowned. But you need stability, security. You say that because you come from a world where everything is measured in results, he replied. I just want to live. Alessandra remained silent. All his life he had sought stability through control, success, and external validation. But Marco showed him something different. A man who didn't need to prove anything. That he didn't live in fear of losing what he had, because he never held on to anything. And for the first time, he wondered if that wasn't true success. Not the accumulation of wealth, not the recognition of others, but the ability to be free within yourself. Alessandra was sitting on the terrace, watching the sunset turn the Tuscan vineyards golden, when she received the call. A former partner, a proposal. We're building something big. Alessandra, said the voice on the other end of the line. And we need someone like you. It was everything he had wanted before his fall. A new company. A second chance. And for the first time, he felt something unexpected. Before, I would have said yes without thinking. She would have taken the first flight to Milan, ready to recover what she had lost. But now, something inside him resisted. He hung up the phone without giving an answer. He stared at the horizon, the question weighing on his mind. Am I ready to return to this world without getting lost in it? 2 days later, Alessandra took a train back to the city. The green landscape of Tuscany was replaced by the concrete and glass jungle, the accelerated pace, the serious faces of people walking in a hurry, the invisible weight of competition, the pressure, the need to prove who you are. For a moment, he felt the old fear return. What if I become the woman who only lived for her success again? He took a deep breath. I'm not the same person who left. I don't have to play the same game. She entered the luxury restaurant where they were waiting for her. 2 men in suits. A contract on the table. Alessandra, her former partner said with a confident smile. You don't know how glad I am to see you back. The words hit her hard. Back, as if his absence had been a mistake. A temporary detour before returning to its true path. You have everything you need here, the other man continued. Financing, contacts, an elite team. The only thing missing is your leadership. The contract was in front of her .A signature, that was all. I needed to recover his empire, but Alessandra did not take up the pen. Tell me something, he said, resting his elbows on the table. Why me? His partner leaned forward. Because you are the best at what you do. Because no one understands the market like you. And because I know you hate to lose. Alessandra felt a chill. That last sentence, that was the hook. The trap he had fallen into his entire life. The idea that if I didn't accept, I was losing. That if I didn't become number one again, I would be nobody. But this time, she saw the truth. And he dared to ask the question that had never been asked before. Do I really want this? For a moment, he imagined his life if he said yes. Luxuries, recognition, the adrenaline of business. But he also saw the sleepless nights, anxiety, crises, the void that not even all the success in the world could fill. The mask returning to its place. And he knew the answer. No. I didn't want to go back from the fear of being nobody. If I came back, I had to do it. From a new identity. Not from the need for validation, but from authenticity. He looked up and smiled. I'm going to think about it. His partner frowned. Think about it? Alessandra, this is a unique opportunity. We can't wait. She grabbed her bag and stood up. If they want me in this project, it will be on my terms. I won't play the same game as before. The 2 men exchanged glances. And what are those terms? Alessandra took a breath. I want creative freedom. I don't want a company that operates under toxic pressure. And I don't want to measure my value based on how big the business is. The partner shook his head. That's not how this world works. Then perhaps I no longer belong to this world, Alessandra said with a calm smile. He grabbed his coat and left the restaurant without looking back. For the first time in his life, he felt like he hadn't lost anything, because now his success did not depend on anyone's approval. I was free. Milan received her with the same frenzy as always. The streets full of executives walking in a hurry, luxurious. Cars sliding down the avenues. Illuminated posters with faces of success and power. Before, Alessandra would have felt a pang of anxiety, an uncontrollable urge to get back on top. But now, something inside him had changed. I didn't feel the urge to prove anything. He wasn't here to take back his throne, was here to start over. He settled in a small apartment in the Brera neighborhood, far from the corporate towers where he used to work. A warm place, full of books and natural light, where I didn't need to pretend anything. He soon received calls from former colleagues, eager to know what her plans were. What are you working on now? They asked, hoping to hear the name of some big company or an ambitious new project. Alessandra was simply smiling. I'm building something different, and he was. But this time, from an authentic place. Without investors putting pressure on it. Without fear of not being enough. Just her creativity, and the freedom to do something she truly loved. For years, their focus had been expansion, market dominance, the insatiable pursuit of results. But now, his new company wasn't about growth at all costs, was trying to create with purpose. He dedicated himself to building a space where people could innovate without fear, where mental health and authenticity were more important than numbers. Where success does not mean sacrificing inner peace. Some investors did not understand his vision, but she didn't care, because for the first time, I wasn't looking for validation. He was building something that really made him happy. There were days when the anxiety reappeared, moments when his old inner voice whispered, "What if you fail? What if this isn't enough?" But this time, instead of fighting that voice, he listened to it with compassion. He understood that his shadow was not his enemy. It was a part of her that just wanted to be seen. The fear of failure, the need for recognition, the pressure to be perfect. Everything was still there. But now, instead of rejecting it, she accepted it. And in doing so, was released. One day, walking through the city, he stopped in front of a display case and saw his reflection. Not the tense face from before, worried about the next goal, but that of a woman at peace with herself. He no longer needed to hide behind success. I was no longer afraid to be vulnerable. For the first time in his life, Alessandra felt complete, because now he knew that his worth did not depend on what he achieved, but who it was, with or without success, and that was something that no one could take him away. The evening sun filtered through the window of her study, dyeing the walls in shades of gold and orange. Alessandra was sitting at her desk, a glass of wine at her side and her journal open in front of her. The blank paper was waiting for her. He took a deep breath and picked up the pen. For years, I had written numbers, strategies, business plans. Today, however, his words came from another place, of its deepest truth. All my life, I ran towards the light to avoid seeing my shadow. I pursued success as if it were the only way to prove my worth. Feared failure because I believed it meant being insignificant. But now, I know the truth. Light without shadow is an illusion. Only when we accept our darkness can we truly shine. As he wrote the last word, he felt a chill run through his skin, not from fear. No doubt, but of certainty. He closed the journal and looked up. In front of her, a mirror reflected her face, the same as always, but different, more serene, more authentic. Alessandra took a deep breath and looked directly into the camera, as if she were talking to every person who saw her. His eyes, once filled with unbridled ambition, now reflected something deeper. Something real. And then, he said the words that would change history. "And you? Have you looked at your shadow lately?" Silence. The image slowly fades away. The screen goes dark, but the question still resonates. Inside each viewer, inside each person who, like Alessandra, has spent their life fleeing from their shadow. And now you have the opportunity to look at it. To accept it. To transform.